1946, British POW camps are emptying. German prisoners are being shipped home. Japanese prisoners are being repatriated. But Italian POWs are lingering. Some are proposing marriage to local British women. Others are negotiating to stay permanently. Many are crying at the prospect of going back to Italy. They'd been captured as enemy soldiers. Now they didn't want to leave. They'd fallen in love with British women, with British life, and with the bizarre way Britain treated prisoners better than Italy had treated its own soldiers. This is the story of 150,000 Italian POWs who spent the war in Britain, discovered tea and fish and chips, charmed the locals, worked on British farms, and in many cases decided they'd rather stay than go home. This is the strangest POW story of World War II. Most Italian soldiers captured by the British never wanted to fight in the first place. Italy entered World War II in June 1940 not because of popular support or military readiness, but because Mussolini wanted to sit at the victor's table when Germany won. The problem: the Italian military wasn't prepared for war. Equipment was outdated. Training was inadequate. Morale was low. Many Italian soldiers were conscripts who had no enthusiasm for fighting Britain or anyone else. When Italy invaded Greece in October 1940, it was a disaster. The Greeks pushed Italy back into Albania. When Italy fought in North Africa, they suffered defeat after defeat. Italian soldiers weren't bad fighters, they were poorly equipped, poorly led, and fighting for a cause most didn't believe in. By 1942 to 1943, Italian soldiers were surrendering to the British in large numbers, especially in North Africa. Entire divisions would surrender en masse. Some units actively sought capture. It was safer than continuing to fight with inadequate supplies against better-equipped enemies. The British captured roughly 150,000 Italian soldiers during the war, most from the North Africa campaign. They shipped them to POW camps in Britain, figuring it was easier to guard them on an island than in North Africa. The Italians arrived expecting the worst. What they found was complicated. Britain treated POWs according to Geneva Conventions, which meant adequate food and shelter, medical care, no forced labor on military projects, ability to send and receive mail, recreation and religious services. For Italian POWs, this was already better treatment than many had received in the Italian army. Italian military discipline was harsh, officers were often incompetent aristocrats, and supplies were chronically inadequate. British POW camps weren't luxurious, they were barbed wire compounds with barracks, guard towers, and basic amenities. But they were warm, dry, and you got 3 meals a day. For soldiers who'd been starving in North African deserts, this was comparative paradise. Under Geneva Conventions, enlisted POWs could be required to work, though not on anything directly supporting the war effort. Britain had a massive labor shortage, millions of British men were in uniform, and farms needed workers. So Italian POWs were put to work on British farms. They'd be trucked out daily from camps to local farms, where they'd do agricultural labor, planting, harvesting, maintaining fields, caring for animals. The farmers paid the British government, which paid the POWs nominal wages in camp scrip. The work was hard but not brutal, and crucially, it got Italian POWs out of the camps and into British communities. This is where things got interesting. British civilians, especially in rural areas where POW camps were located, encountered Italian POWs daily. And to the surprise of both sides, they got along remarkably well. Italian POWs were generally friendly, expressive, and charming. They'd sing while working. They'd gesture enthusiastically. They'd try to communicate in broken English. After years of war rationing and grimness, their Mediterranean warmth was refreshing to British civilians. British farmers and their families, for their part, treated Italian POWs with pragmatic civility. These weren't fanatic Nazis or dangerous enemies, they were young men, far from home, doing farm work. Many British farmers came to like their Italian workers. The Italians were shocked by this. They'd expected to be treated as enemies, possibly abused, certainly kept at hostile distance. Instead, British farmers were offering them tea, inviting them to eat lunch with the family, and treating them like hired help rather than prisoners. In September 1943, Italy surrendered and switched sides, joining the Allies against Germany. This created a bizarre situation for Italian POWs in Britain. They were technically no longer enemies. They were now co-belligerents, allies, sort of. But they couldn't go home because Italy was still a war zone, partially occupied by Germans. So they stayed in POW camps, but under increasingly relaxed conditions. The British government started allowing Italian POWs more freedom. They could leave camps unsupervised to work on farms. Some were allowed into nearby towns. Restrictions loosened considerably. They were still technically prisoners but treated more like guest workers. This is when the real cultural exchange began. Italian POWs, with time and basic materials, transformed their camps. They built chapels with elaborate decorations. They created gardens. They painted murals on barrack walls. They constructed fountains and sculptures from scrap materials. The most famous example is the Italian chapel on Orkney, built by Italian POWs using 2 Nissen huts, scrap metal, and concrete. They transformed a basic military structure into a beautiful chapel with painted frescoes, ornate altar, and wrought iron fixtures, all made from salvaged materials. British guards were bemused. British soldiers wouldn't have thought to beautify a prison camp. But Italians couldn't stand living somewhere ugly, even temporarily. Aesthetic matters. Beauty matters. If you're stuck somewhere, make it beautiful. This attitude charmed the British. The Italians weren't just accepting captivity, they were making art, creating beauty, and maintaining dignity. It was impressive. Italian POWs were fed standard British rations, bland food, lots of potatoes, overboiled vegetables, mysterious meat dishes. To Italian palates, it was horrific. So Italian POWs started supplementing their diets. They'd grow vegetables in camp gardens. They'd trade for ingredients. When working on farms, they'd barter their labor for fresh produce, eggs, or meat. And they'd cook. Italian POWs would prepare proper Italian meals, pasta, sauces, soups, using whatever ingredients they could scrounge. The smell of garlic and tomatoes wafting from POW camps was exotic in 1940s rural Britain, where garlic was essentially unknown. British guards and local civilians became curious. What were the Italians cooking? Could they try some? Italian POWs, proud of their cuisine, would share. This is how many rural British people had their first experience with Italian food. One farmer's wife later recalled, "The Italian boys working our farm couldn't stand our cooking. So they'd make lunch themselves, pasta with our vegetables and some cheese they'd gotten somewhere. It was revelation. We'd never eaten anything like it." The music and culture. Italians sang. Constantly. They'd sing while working in fields, while marching back to camps, during evening recreation. Opera arias, folk songs, popular music, the Italians had a soundtrack. British civilians found this exotic and charming. British culture was more reserved, you didn't just burst into song while plowing a field. But Italians did, and it made farm work more bearable. Some POW camps organized concerts where Italian prisoners would perform for guards and local civilians. These became popular community events. The Italians would sing, perform comedy sketches, and entertain. It was a bizarre wartime cultural exchange, enemy prisoners entertaining British civilians. This is where things got complicated. Italian POWs were young men. British rural areas had lots of young women whose British boyfriends were away fighting. Proximity, charm, and loneliness led to predictable results. British women started developing romantic relationships with Italian POWs. This was officially forbidden and socially scandalous. These were enemy soldiers. British soldiers were dying fighting Italians and Germans. How could British women consort with the enemy? But it happened anyway. Italian POWs, working daily on British farms, would encounter the farmer's daughter or local village women. Conversations would lead to flirtation. Flirtation would lead to romance. By 1944 to 1945, significant numbers of Italian POWs were in relationships with British women. The authorities tried to prevent this. POWs weren't supposed to fraternize beyond work requirements. Women seen with Italian POWs face social condemnation. But love, or at least attraction, doesn't follow regulations. Britain also held German POWs during this period, and the treatment and dynamics were completely different. German POWs were kept under stricter guard. They were less trusted, more suspected of fanaticism. They didn't integrate into British communities the same way. Romances between British women and German POWs happened but were rarer and more condemned. Why the difference? Several reasons. 1. Italians surrendered earlier and switched sides, making them less threatening. 2. Italian cultural warmth and expressiveness was more appealing than German formality. 3. British anti-German sentiment was stronger than anti-Italian sentiment. 4. Italians were seen as less ideologically committed to fascism. Italian POWs benefited from being the less bad enemy. They weren't Nazis. They were just unlucky soldiers who'd been drafted to fight for Mussolini. The British could feel relatively comfortable befriending them. Italian POWs introduced British farms to new techniques and approaches. They had experience with Mediterranean agriculture and brought different perspectives. They introduced different planting methods, crop rotations they'd learned in Italy, and approaches to animal husbandry. Not all of it worked in British climate, but some did. British farmers began adopting Italian innovations. More importantly, Italian POWs worked hard. They'd been farmers in Italy, they knew agriculture. British farmers came to depend on their Italian workers and trusted them with increasingly complex tasks. By 1944 to 1945, some Italian POWs were essentially running farms while the British owner just supervised. The British farmer would be off in town on market day, and the Italians would handle everything. This was remarkable trust for enemy prisoners. Some British villages essentially adopted Italian POW camps. The prisoners became part of community life. They'd attend local events, help with village projects, and integrate into the social fabric. In some cases, Italian POWs helped repair churches, build community centers, or do construction projects for local councils. They'd volunteer for this work, it gave them something to do and built goodwill with locals. British civilians would visit camps to socialize with Italian POWs. Women would bring home-baked goods. Children would visit to hear Italians tell stories or teach them Italian words. The line between prisoners and community members became increasingly blurred. As 1945 progressed and the war ended, Italian POWs faced a crucial question: what would they return to in Italy? Italy was devastated. The country had been a battlefield for 2 years. Cities were bombed. Infrastructure was destroyed. The economy was collapsed. Food was scarce. Political situation was chaotic. Many Italian POWs had been gone since 1941 or 1942, 4 or 5 years. They had no idea if their families were alive, if their homes still existed, if they'd have jobs. Letters from home, when they got through, described desperate conditions. Meanwhile, in Britain, Italian POWs had steady work, adequate food, and relatively comfortable lives. Some had British girlfriends or fiancées. They built lives in Britain, however strange it was to be technically prisoners. The question became, why leave? For Italian POWs in relationships with British women, marriage offered a path to staying in Britain. If you married a British citizen, you could potentially apply for residency. Proposals happened. British women and Italian POWs married in significant numbers in 1945 to 1946. These were technically legal, POWs could marry with permission from British authorities. But they were socially controversial. British soldiers returning from war were not happy to find Italian POWs married to British women. There were tensions, fights, and social ostracism. Women who married Italian POWs faced judgment from communities that saw them as traitors. But the marriages happened anyway. Love, or pragmatic calculation, or both. Italian POWs saw marriage as their best chance to stay in Britain. British women saw opportunity to build lives with men who were present, charming, and devoted to them. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 Italian POWs married British women during or immediately after the war. British authorities faced a dilemma. Officially, POWs should be repatriated. But Britain desperately needed agricultural labour. British men were returning from war, but many didn't want farm work, they wanted better-paying industrial or commercial jobs. Italian POWs were experienced farm workers, already integrated into British agriculture, trusted by farmers, and willing to stay. From an economic perspective, keeping them made sense. Some British farmers lobbied government to allow Italian POWs to stay. They'd submit letters attesting to the good character and hard work of specific Italian POWs, requesting they be allowed to remain as civilian workers. The government was sympathetic but cautious. Public opinion was mixed. Housing was scarce. Jobs were needed for returning British soldiers. But the labour shortage was real. In 1947, Britain created the European Voluntary Worker Scheme to bring continental European workers to Britain to fill labour shortages. This provided a legal framework for Italian POWs to transition from prisoner status to immigrant worker status. Many Italian POWs applied and were accepted. They'd be released from POW status, sign contracts for agricultural or industrial work, and become legal residents. They'd no longer be prisoners, they'd be immigrants. This scheme allowed thousands of Italian former POWs to stay in Britain legally. They'd move out of camps into regular housing, bring over families eventually, and build permanent lives. Not all Italian POWs who wanted to stay could. Some had criminal records or disciplinary problems that disqualified them. Others couldn't find employers to sponsor them. Some had families in Italy they felt obligated to return to. For these men, repatriation was heartbreaking. They'd spent years in Britain, built relationships, and found a better life than what awaited them in Italy. But they had no legal path to stay. Some left Britain promising to return. A few succeeded years later through legal immigration. Others never made it back and spent the rest of their lives regretting what they'd left behind. When Italian POWs were repatriated in 1946 to 1947, the farewells were emotional. British farmers who'd employed them for years said goodbye to workers they'd come to rely on and like. British women who'd fallen in love with Italian POWs but couldn't or wouldn't marry them faced permanent separation. Some Italian POWs cried openly at leaving. They'd write letters promising to return. They'd exchange addresses and photos. Some maintained correspondence for years. British communities that had hosted Italian POW camps held farewell parties. They'd present gifts, share meals, and exchange addresses. The enemies who'd arrived in 1942 to 1943 were leaving as friends in 1946 to 1947. Approximately 150,000 Italian POWs held in Britain during the war. About 5,000 to 10,000 stayed permanently through marriage or worker schemes. Several thousand more returned to Italy but later immigrated back to Britain legally. Tens of thousands maintained correspondence with British friends and former employers for decades. The Italian POWs who stayed in Britain built lives, raised families, and became part of British communities. Their children and grandchildren are British today, descendants of prisoners who fell in love with their captors. The Italian POWs who stayed were pioneers of Britain's post-war Italian community. Many opened restaurants, cafes, or food shops, introducing British palates to proper Italian cuisine. The fish and chip shops many Italians opened became British institutions. Italian ice cream parlors became community gathering places. Italian cafes served espresso and pastries to Brits who'd never encountered such things. These former POWs were cultural ambassadors, bridging Italian and British cultures in practical, delicious ways. The British love affair with Italian food started partly because of POWs who stayed and cooked. The children of British women and Italian former POWs grew up in an interesting position, half Italian, half British, in 1950s-60s Britain. Some faced discrimination as children of the enemy. Others integrated smoothly into British society. Most grew up appreciating both cultures, British reserve and Italian expressiveness, British stoicism and Italian emotion. Many of these now elderly children have shared their parents' stories in recent years, contributing to a fuller understanding of this unique World War II story. Some British villages still remember their Italian POWs fondly. The Italian chapel on Orkney is maintained as a tourist attraction and reminder of the Italian presence. Local historical societies preserve stories of Italian POWs who worked local farms. In some cases, villages maintained contact with former Italian POWs for decades. Former prisoners would return to visit the communities where they'd been held, reuniting with farmers they'd worked for or women they'd loved. These reunions, documented in local newspapers, showed affection and friendship that transcended the war. For Italians who stayed, their relationship with their homeland was complicated. They'd left Italy during its darkest period and built better lives in the country that had defeated Italy in war. Some felt guilty about this, abandoning Italy when it needed rebuilding. Others felt they'd been smart, escaping poverty and chaos for opportunity. Most felt ambivalent, love for Italy as homeland, but no regret about choosing Britain. Their letters and memoirs describe this duality: Italian hearts, British lives. They'd teach their children Italian, cook Italian food, maintain Italian culture, but they'd also become British in practical ways, adapting to British society while preserving Italian identity. The Italian POW experience in Britain was unusual compared to other nationalities. German POWs, kept under stricter guard, less trusted, fewer stayed permanently. Japanese POWs, almost none held in Britain. Those in other Allied nations were repatriated entirely. Soviet POWs, tragic story of forced repatriation to persecution. American, British POWs in Axis hands, generally returned home eagerly when freed. Italian POWs in Britain represent perhaps the most positive POW experience of World War II. This doesn't minimize the fact of imprisonment, but within the context of a devastating war, Italian POWs got remarkably lucky in where they ended up. Several factors made the Italian POW experience in Britain unusually positive. 1. Cultural compatibility. Mediterranean warmth met British reserve in surprisingly complementary ways. 2. Timing. Italy switching sides in 1943 removed ideological barriers. 3. Labor needs. Britain desperately needed workers, creating economic incentive to treat POWs well. 4. Geneva Conventions. British adherence to international law ensured humane treatment. 5. Italian attitude. Italian POWs generally weren't fanatically loyal to Mussolini, making them easy to get along with. 6. Geography. Britain's island location made escape pointless, allowing relaxed security. These factors combined to create an environment where enemy prisoners could become community members, workers, friends, and eventually permanent residents. In recent decades, Italian POW descendants have researched their fathers' and grandfathers' experiences. They've visited POW campsites, tracked down British families their relatives knew, and pieced together stories. Documentaries and books have covered this history, bringing wider attention to this unusual World War II story. The Italian chapel on Orkney attracts thousands of visitors annually. Historical societies preserve oral histories of Italians who stayed. This history challenges simple narratives about World War II. Not every enemy encounter was hateful. Not every prisoner experience was horrific. Sometimes, even in war, people connected across battle lines in ways that led to lasting friendships, families, and communities. In 1942 to 1943, Britain captured 150,000 Italian soldiers and shipped them to POW camps across the British countryside. They were the enemy, defeated in battle, prisoners to be guarded and eventually returned home. But something unexpected happened. The Italians sang while working in British fields. They cooked with garlic, a shocking ingredient in wartime Britain. They built beautiful chapels from scrap metal and painted frescoes on barrack walls. They charmed British farmers, befriended British communities, and fell in love with British women. By 1945, when the war ended, thousands of Italian POWs didn't want to go home. Italy was devastated. Britain, despite rationing and war damage, offered work, stability, and relationships they'd built. Some married British women. Others found civilian work permits. Many simply lingered as long as possible before reluctantly repatriating. An estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Italian POWs stayed permanently. They became farmers, restaurant owners, cafe operators, and members of British communities. Their descendants are British today, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of prisoners who fell in love with their captors. This isn't the typical World War II POW story. There's no brutal captivity, no desperate escape attempts, no counting days until liberation. Instead, there's farm work and village dances, Italian cooking lessons and British tea ceremonies, romances across enemy lines and villages that adopted their prisoners. It's a reminder that even in total war, human connections happen. That enemies can become friends, prisoners can become community members, and sometimes the line between captor and captive dissolves into something more complicated and human. The Italian POWs who stayed didn't betray Italy, they chose survival, opportunity, and love over returning to devastation. Britain gained workers, citizens, and cultural enrichment. Both sides benefited from this strange wartime romance. And somewhere in Britain today, there's probably an elderly person whose Italian grandfather arrived as a prisoner in 1942, fell in love with the country that captured him, and never left. Have you heard stories of Italian POWs in your area? Let me know in the comments.